My name is Michelle Carter, and I'm 31 years old. What happened when my father opened the small velvet box I placed in his hands at his retirement celebration last Saturday night is something that will forever change how our family understands sacrifice, recognition, and which child had actually been supporting him through the most difficult period of his career. Picture this: my dad standing in front of 150 colleagues, friends, and family members, his confident smile vanishing as he lifted the contents of that box, not just any gift, but the original deed to our family home, purchased back from foreclosure with money he never knew I had. You see, that moment when Dad's hands trembled as he read the property documents wasn't just shock, it was the devastating realization that while he'd been publicly thanking my brothers for their professional achievements and family support, his daughter had quietly spent the past 3 years preventing the loss of everything he'd worked to build, using success he'd never bothered to acknowledge or understand. Before we dive into this story, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy stories about invisible support finally coming to light at exactly the moment when it matters most. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. I love connecting with people who understand that sometimes the most meaningful gifts aren't the ones that get recognition, but the ones that preserve what matters most when no one else is watching. Let me take you back to the beginning of my father's financial crisis 3 years ago, when his small accounting firm was struggling to survive an economic downturn that had cost him most of his long-term clients and put our family home at risk of foreclosure. Dad had built Carter and Associates over 25 years, growing it from a one-person operation into a respected firm that served small businesses throughout our region. But when the recession hit, many of his clients either went out of business or switched to cheaper online accounting services, leaving Dad with overhead he couldn't cover and commitments he couldn't maintain. The crisis came to a head in March 2021, when Dad gathered our family for a dinner that would reveal just how dire his financial situation had become. "I need to be honest with all of you about what's happening with the business," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had never expected to have this conversation with his children. My brothers, Marcus and James, listened with the appropriate concern as Dad explained that Carter and Associates was essentially bankrupt, that he'd exhausted his business credit trying to maintain operations, and that the family home, the house where we'd all grown up, was facing foreclosure because he'd used it as collateral for business loans that he could no longer repay. "How much do you owe on the house?" Marcus asked. As the eldest son and a successful corporate lawyer, he naturally took the lead in family financial discussions. $180,000 to bring the mortgage current, plus another $220,000 in business debt that's secured against the property. So $400,000 total to clear everything? That's the minimum to prevent foreclosure and keep the business operating long enough to recover. The sum was staggering, far beyond what any of us could contribute individually. But what happened next revealed everything about our family dynamics and who Dad looked to for solutions during crisis situations. "Marcus, I know this is a lot to ask, but I wondered if you might be able to help with part of the debt," Dad said, his voice heavy with the difficulty of asking his children for financial assistance. "Dad, I wish I could, but Sarah and I just bought our house, and we're stretched pretty thin with our own mortgage and the kids' expenses." "I understand. James, what about your situation?" "Dad, you know I'd help if I could, but with Lisa's medical bills and my student loans, we're barely making ends meet." Both my brothers were telling the truth about their financial limitations, but what struck me was that Dad had naturally turned to them first, not because they had more money than I did, but because he viewed them as the family members whose financial capabilities mattered when serious problems needed solving. "What about you, Michelle?" he asked finally, almost as an afterthought. "What about me what? Can you contribute anything toward resolving this situation?" The question was asked with the tone someone uses when they're being polite but don't expect a meaningful response. Dad knew I worked in graphic design, had never married, and lived in a modest apartment. In his mind, I was probably the least capable of providing substantial financial assistance. "How much time do we have before foreclosure proceedings start?" I asked. 90 days, maybe less if the bank decides to accelerate the process." 90 days to find $400,000 or watch our family lose everything Dad had spent his career building. The challenge seemed impossible, but what Dad didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had been preparing for exactly this kind of crisis for years. My graphic design career wasn't the modest freelance work they assumed it was. Over the past 8 years, I had built a digital marketing agency that specialized in creating comprehensive brand identities for technology companies. My client list included 3 Fortune 500 corporations, and my annual revenue had grown to over $800,000. But I'd kept the scope of my success private, partly because I preferred living simply, and partly because I'd learned that family dynamics became complicated when there were significant differences in financial capability among siblings. "I'll see what I can do," I told Dad, knowing that I could solve his entire financial crisis immediately but wanting to understand the full situation before making that kind of commitment. Over the following weeks, I researched Dad's debts, analyzed his business situation, and developed a comprehensive plan for resolving both the immediate foreclosure threat and the underlying business problems that had created the crisis. But I also watched how the family responded to Dad's financial emergency, and what I observed taught me important lessons about recognition, gratitude, and who gets credit for family support. If you've ever been the family member with hidden resources while everyone else worried about problems you could solve, type "silent solution" in the comments. What comes next will show you how complicated it can become when your ability to help far exceeds anyone's expectations. The 90 days leading up to potential foreclosure were filled with family meetings, strategy discussions, and increasingly desperate attempts to find solutions that would prevent Dad from losing everything he'd built. Marcus and James both made genuine efforts to help within their means. Marcus provided $15,000 from his savings and connected Dad with bankruptcy attorneys who might be able to negotiate with creditors. James contributed $8,000 and spent hours helping Dad reorganize his business records to present the strongest possible case to the bank. Their contributions were valuable and appreciated, but they represented a tiny fraction of what was needed to actually solve the crisis. Meanwhile, I was quietly implementing a comprehensive financial rescue plan that would not only prevent the foreclosure but position Dad's business for future success. First, I established a Delaware corporation that would serve as the vehicle for acquiring Dad's debt and property. Using my business attorney, I negotiated directly with the bank to purchase the foreclosure debt at a discount, paying $320,000 to acquire all claims against the family home. Second, I created a business recovery plan for Carter and Associates that involved modernizing their technology, expanding their service offerings, and developing marketing strategies that would attract new clients in the post-recession economy. Third, I arranged for my corporation to hire Carter and Associates as a preferred vendor for accounting services, providing them with a $60,000 annual contract that would stabilize their cash flow while Dad rebuilt his client base. But I structured everything to appear as if Dad had found an anonymous investor who was willing to save both his home and his business in exchange for a minority stake in the company's future success. The rescue happened gradually over 6 weeks, with Dad receiving official notifications that his debt had been purchased by a private investment company, that foreclosure proceedings had been suspended, and that Carter and Associates had been selected for a consulting contract that would provide steady income during their recovery period. "I can't believe this is happening," Dad told us during a family dinner where he shared news about the mysterious investor who had saved our family home. "Who is this investor?" Marcus asked. "How did they even know about your situation?" "The attorney handling the transaction says they specialize in helping family businesses recover from temporary financial difficulties. They're apparently impressed by our firm's long-term track record and potential for growth." "What do they want in return?" "A 25% stake in Carter and Associates and the right to provide strategic guidance for business development. It's incredibly generous terms for someone willing to risk this kind of money on our recovery." The family celebrated Dad's good fortune while I sat quietly, listening to everyone express amazement at the anonymous benefactor who had appeared just in time to save everything that mattered to our patriarch. Over the following months, Carter and Associates not only recovered but began thriving under the strategic guidance provided by the anonymous investor, strategic guidance that I was actually providing through carefully structured business consulting that helped Dad modernize his operations and expand his client base. But what became increasingly clear during this recovery period was how Dad distributed credit and recognition for the family support he'd received during his crisis. At family gatherings, he would praise Marcus for his legal expertise and financial contribution, acknowledging how his eldest son had stepped up during the family's most difficult period. He would thank James for his bookkeeping assistance and emotional support, recognizing how his middle son had sacrificed time and money to help the family business survive. When my contributions were mentioned at all, they were described vaguely as Michelle helping however she could or everyone in the family doing their part. This pattern continued for 3 years as Carter and Associates returned to profitability and Dad began planning for his eventual retirement. The anonymous investor remained mysterious, continuing to provide strategic guidance and financial support while Dad rebuilt his reputation and client relationships. But throughout this recovery period, I watched Dad give credit to Marcus and James for their visible contributions while never understanding that the anonymous investor who had actually saved everything was sitting at his dinner table every Sunday. The retirement party was planned as a celebration of Dad's 35-year career and successful recovery from near bankruptcy. The guest list included current and former clients, business colleagues, extended family, and friends who wanted to honor his professional achievements and resilience during difficult times. I had planned to attend the party quietly, celebrate Dad's accomplishments, and continue maintaining the privacy around my role in his financial rescue. But something about the evening's program changed my mind about remaining anonymous. Dad's retirement speech was a masterpiece of gratitude and family appreciation. He thanked his clients for their loyalty, his employees for their dedication, and his family for their support during his most challenging period. I especially want to recognize my sons, Marcus and James, he said, his voice full of emotion as he addressed the crowd of 150 people. When my business was failing and I faced losing everything I'd worked to build, these 2 young men stepped up with both financial support and practical assistance that helped me survive the worst crisis of my professional life. The applause was warm and genuine as Marcus and James stood to acknowledge their father's gratitude. They had indeed provided valuable support during Dad's crisis, and they deserved recognition for their contributions. Marcus used his legal expertise to help me navigate bankruptcy proceedings and creditor negotiations, Dad continued. James spent countless hours helping me reorganize my business records and develop new client service protocols. Their support meant everything to me during those dark months. More applause. More acknowledgement of my brother's valuable contributions to the family crisis. Of course, I'm also grateful to Michelle for her support during this difficult time, Dad added, almost as an afterthought. She helped however she could. 3 years of secretly funding his rescue, providing strategic business guidance, and ensuring his financial security, reduced to a generic acknowledgement that I had helped however I could. That's when I made my decision. I had brought a gift for Dad, something I'd been saving for the right moment to reveal my role in his recovery. But hearing him distribute credit and recognition while completely missing the most significant support he'd received, I realized the right moment had arrived. During the gift presentation portion of the evening, I approached Dad with a small velvet jewelry box. "Dad, I have something special for you," I said, handing him the box in front of everyone. "Michelle, you shouldn't have spent money on gifts," he replied with the affectionate dismissiveness he typically showed toward my financial capabilities. "Just open it," I said, my voice carrying an edge that caught his attention. He opened the box expecting to find a watch, cufflinks, or some other traditional retirement gift appropriate to what he assumed was my limited budget. Instead, he found the original deed to our family home, transferred back to his name, along with a letter that began, "To Dad, from your anonymous investor who has spent the past 3 years ensuring that you could retire with dignity instead of losing everything to foreclosure." The silence that followed was absolute. Dad stared at the documents in the box, his hands trembling as he processed what he was seeing. The deed to the house I had saved. The letter explaining who had actually rescued his business. The revelation that his anonymous benefactor had been sitting at his family dinners for 3 years while he praised my brothers for contributions that paled in comparison to what I had quietly provided. "Michelle," he whispered, his voice barely audible even with the microphone. "How did you?" "I'm the investor who saved your home and your business, Dad. I'm the one who bought your debt, prevented the foreclosure, provided the consulting contract, and guided Carter and Associates back to profitability. For 3 years, I've been your anonymous business partner while you thanked Marcus and James for helping however they could." The revelation hit the room like a bomb. 150 people staring at the father and daughter whose family dynamics had just been completely recontextualized. The daughter, who had been acknowledged as helping however she could, had actually been the architect of his entire financial recovery. "You paid $320,000 to save our house?" he asked, his voice growing stronger as the reality of what I'd done began to sink in. "I paid $400,000 to save your house and your business. I provided another $180,000 in consulting fees over the past 3 years to ensure Carter and Associates could rebuild its client base and remain profitable." $580,000? Plus strategic guidance, business development support, and marketing strategies that helped you recover from bankruptcy. While you were thanking Marcus for his $15,000 contribution and James for his bookkeeping assistance, I was ensuring you had a business to retire from and a home to retire in. The party had essentially stopped. Guests were staring at the family drama unfolding on stage, trying to understand how they'd just learned that the evening's honoree had completely misunderstood who had been supporting him through his greatest crisis. "Michelle, why didn't you tell me?" Dad asked, tears forming in his eyes as he processed the magnitude of what he'd missed. "Because I wanted you to succeed on your own merits, with support rather than charity. But also because I wanted to see if you would recognize and appreciate what I was contributing to this family. And I failed that test. You spent 3 years praising Marcus and James for helping however they could while I was actually saving everything you'd worked to build. Tonight, you reduced my contributions to the same phrase, helping however I could, while thanking them for support that totaled $23,000 compared to my $580,000. The confrontation continued for several more minutes, with Dad apologizing for his blindness and me explaining how his assumptions about my financial capabilities had prevented him from seeing what I'd actually been accomplishing for our family. But the most important outcome wasn't his apology, it was the knowledge that I had chosen to reveal the truth at exactly the moment when his misunderstanding of family contributions was most publicly displayed. Sometimes the most powerful gift isn't money or support, it's the revelation that forces someone to confront how wrong they've been about who deserves their gratitude and recognition. And sometimes the sweetest vindication is simply letting the truth speak for itself when assumptions have become too comfortable to examine. The retirement party continued, but it became a very different celebration, one where Dad's gratitude was finally directed toward the daughter who had actually saved his career and his home while he spent 3 years thanking the wrong people for contributions that mattered far less than what he'd been taking for granted. What invisible support have you provided that went unrecognized? What family member has underestimated your contributions while celebrating others? Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever been the family problem solver whose efforts were overlooked while others received credit, you're not alone. Comment invisible support if you understand the frustration of being underestimated by people who benefit from your help. Share this story with someone who needs to know that true support often happens behind the scenes, and recognition isn't always immediate but can be powerfully meaningful when it finally comes. Subscribe and hit the notification bell for more stories about family recognition, hidden generosity, and the moment when assumptions about your capabilities meet the reality of what you've actually accomplished. I'd love to know, should family members be more curious about each other's contributions, or is it natural that visible support gets more recognition than invisible help? Let me know in the comments. Remember, your value doesn't require their recognition to be real, but when that recognition finally comes through undeniable evidence, it can transform relationships in ways that benefit everyone.